Okay, we're going to continue with the student feedback for prompt B. We have already started. Um, we've already done the first half of the student feedback sheet for prompt B. This feedback sheet is a little more extensive just because this prompt was a little harder. You had to create your own categories. They weren't hinted or referenced in the prompt, and so a few students tripped up a bit on this one. So the next part of the feedback that I'm going to address is the thesis statement. Well, I've kind of been talking about the thesis the whole time, but these are examples of an ineffective thesis statement. For the most part, it just doesn't answer the question that was asked, or it's unorganized, or it's hard to follow. And so we'll look at this one by one. Let's just for a minute redress the prompt. Explain and assess the varying, well, it doesn't say varying, but explain and assess the underlying causes of the American Revolution and determine the single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away from Great Britain. So we know that this is sort of asking us two different questions. What are the causes of the revolution? And then which single cause was most enticing? And so that should be evident in the thesis statement, the answer to both of those questions. So student number 9 here, their thesis is that Britain took control over the colonists. They made an act which they had to pay taxes on documents. This act was known as the Stamp Act. Many boycotted and started fights which led to the American Revolution. Documents such as the Declaration of Independence made colonists want their freedom more and let them realize they have rights. This caused them to break away from Great Britain. Okay, so this thesis is like a storybook. You know, you're kind of like, this thing happened, then next this happens, and then the third thing happens, and the fourth thing happens. It's not very organized. It's not concise enough. It's too chronological. The whole tone of the statement, it's like this and this and then that and that. And so this does not answer the question that was asked. So what were the causes? And so refrain from referencing the names of specific events. There's no need to use the word Stamp Act. Just say Britain took control over the colonists. That's not really even that's not even really important. That really shouldn't be in here because they never took control over the colonies. They lost control. They were theirs to start with. So anyway, so maybe some of the causes you could label because of unfair taxation. Maybe that could be a cause since you're talking about the Stamp Act. Also, colonial protests and resistance. That could be a cause since you're talking about boycotting. So if I were student number 9, we could say unfair taxes, colonial boycotts, and resistance. And then here you're talking about the Declaration of Independence and the desire to be free were the primary causes of the American Revolution. It's never a good idea to reference specific events, so it's no need to talk about the Declaration of Independence. So see how this one sentence basically says the exact same thing as this whole paragraph here. Unfair taxes, colonial boycotts and resistance, and the desire to be free were the primary causes of the American Revolution. So, no need to even say this caused them to break away. Well, I mean, you can if you want to. The only other thing that this is missing is, well, what was the single most enticing cause? That is not anywhere in your thesis. So a person would have to figure that out. The single most enticing cause was their lack of economic opportunity, or we say economic freedom. That's just kind of an example. So, this would be a way more effective thesis than kind of what's up here. All right, student number 7, taxation without representation was the primary reasons for the colonists to break away from Great Britain. Okay, this is one thing you've talked about. So you can't use plural here. You've only talked about one thing. So that's just one reason, which caused the American Revolution, along with things such as the Boston Massacre. Okay, so this is a very skeletal type of thesis. It does not really account for all of the documents. You've only talked about two things: their resistance to taxation, and you've only talked about one event, the Boston Massacre. So maybe a different way to state this was oppressive taxation, military presence in the colonies, and other means of overbearing oppression. I'm just making up something right here because I have nothing else to work with from this thesis, were the causes of the American Revolution. So see how we have this thesis is much more direct. It references these events that you're sort of hinting to in a much more broader way. And the reason that you want the thesis to be so broad is so that in the body paragraphs you can talk about more events. You can extend the body paragraphs and it still aligns with the thesis. So if you keep the thesis broad but still relevant, then you have so many other things that you can talk about. If you only reference the Boston Massacre in that paragraph, you can only talk about the Boston Massacre. Well, that's not going to be very efficient. It's not going to be well-rounded. It's going to be too narrow in scope. So anyway, and then you have to answer the second part of the question. What was the most enticing cause? So that's a second sentence. The most enticing cause was, and you have to figure out what that is, whether or not it's the lack of freedom or restricted trade. You have to figure out something to cite as the most enticing cause. Now the next student, student number 8, the varying and underlying causes of the American Revolution was taxation without representation. Colonists were not a part of government processes, and the colonists were overtaxed for goods. The single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away from Great Britain was taxation without representation. Okay, this is actually an excellent thesis. It should stop right here. Like, this highlighted text should be the thesis. That's great. You have covered all required elements. Taxation without representation, that's one cause. The colonists not being a part of the government processes, that's another cause. Excellent. Colonists were being overtaxed. Excellent. And then you explicitly reference the single cause. All of this here is just kind of babble. They were being taxed without being heard or getting to share their opinion. That is way too specific. That needs to be in a body paragraph when you are defending your claim. This should not be in a thesis. There was no one to represent the colonists in governance meetings. You've already said that. You've already said that in the thesis. So this is not adding any more value here to your statement. Prices for household goods were now more expensive. Okay, that is also way too detailed. So all of this you need to just take out. So, great job though. Really good job. Student number 11, the American Revolution wasn't caused by one action. Oh man, this is a huge red flag. Huge red flag. The question asks us, assess the underlying causes of the revolution. So it's already known that many things started this event. And it just asks you to make a judgment, state a claim. What was the single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away? If they are kind of, the prompt kind of corners you and it's forcing you to acknowledge something, some category of causes that had more weight or more influence. So you have to do that. It's a judgment. You're not stating fact. This is a theory. This is a hypothesis. So to start off by saying, well, there wasn't it wasn't caused by one action. All right, that's not a good idea. We know it wasn't caused by one action, but what are the various different causes? Which one was most significant, or which cause, as I mentioned earlier, had the most weight? So the British viewpoints and how they forced things. Okay, so that's a cause. So maybe you could reword that as I'm trying to think. Force things. All governments force things. So maybe, I don't know. You just have to figure out a way to reword this. I'm not sure your intent right here, but a cause could be that the colonists developed different viewpoints of the British. So that's kind of like changing ideologies, that the colonists experienced changing ideologies. But but here about force things, I'm not sure how you can reword that part. The colonists' reactions to these things. Okay, what were their reactions? You need to be a little more descriptive here. So maybe you should say something like rebellious colonial actions or rebellious colonial reactions. That way, you're not just in a bland way saying, "Oh, the colonial reaction started the revolution." Well, what were those reactions? Were they hostile? Were they violent? Were they vengeful? What kind of reactions? So, and the single point that started hostility, the Boston Massacre. Okay, so that's okay. It's usually, you usually want to restrain from specific events in the thesis, but since this prompt suggested a single cause, it is okay in this case. If you want to say the Boston Massacre, you acknowledge that as the single cause. I think that's okay. So this prompt actually has a lot of potential. This has a lot of potential. You just have to figure out how to reword this part right here. It's just hard to follow your intent, but that's actually a pretty good start. So, and then the last parts here that I noticed of the student feedback sheet, well, wow, last big part, is that be sure to answer each component of the question that was asked. And so this particular prompt, the prompt asks you two questions. Explain and assess the underlying causes of the revolution. That's kind of question one. And then determine the single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away. So in your prompt, you have to reference what are the causes, what is the single most enticing cause. So here, student number 3, you did not reference the single most enticing cause. You talked about the causes. Many causes of the revolution were colonial desire, British oppression, etc. All right, excellent. Great way to classify it. Overall, I think the main cause was colonial desire for equality, challenging the government to enforce the rights and speak their mind. Okay, so you can't say main cause and then list 3 things, because that's in essence what you did. So, so you're on the right track here, but just doesn't fit into the formula, the requested kind of format. Student number 4, relationships and views of the colonists and British began to run cold after the French and Indian War. Conflicting goals and views, neglect for colonial rights, and propaganda toward Britain would eventually erupt into a 7-year-long war. That's a great sentence right here that that classifies the different causes of the war. Perhaps the lack of respect toward the colonists was the reason for the slippery slope that became the American Revolution. All right. So here I am assuming you are acknowledging this as the single cause, but you didn't explicitly state that. The single cause, you just said perhaps the lack of respect towards the colonists was the reason. So there were many reasons. You already know that there are many reasons. You listed them. So all this thesis needs is a single word, which is single. Because the prompt asked us determine the single cause. Because it asked us the single cause, we have to respond back with our view of what the single cause was, and not just the reason, but it has to be explicit, the single reason. Student number 5, the 3 main causes of the revolution are taxes, propaganda, and most importantly, the formation of a new government. Excellent classification of the different causes. The taxes angered the colonists. Okay, now this goes into detail about what's already stated. You don't need details in a thesis. Don't defend your thesis in the thesis. You can't do that. Defend the thesis in the body paragraphs. So the taxes angered the colonists because they were made without their consent. That needs to go into body paragraph 1, because how you have this thesis set up, in the first paragraph you only talk about the taxes. In the second paragraph you only talk about the propaganda. The third paragraph you only talk about the formation of the new government, or this attempt to form a new government. So right here, this does not go, this doesn't fit well in the thesis because it's not an overview of the of your stated claim here. And so here, the propaganda, that needs to go in body paragraph 2, because the second category is propaganda. So anyway, way too many details here in the thesis. Also, you failed to mention what was the single most enticing cause. That's not in there. All right, so student number 6, the American Revolution had various underlying causes, such as rebellion against British forces and the organization of the American government that wanted to operate against the theories and teachings of the British, while other things, such as abrasive British rule, made the colonists want to break away from Great Britain. All right, these are, this thesis statement is fine. It's just incomplete. So the only thing that's not obvious here is, what are you deeming as the single most enticing cause? You kind of insinuate, well, I'm just assuming that British rule, abrasive British rule, but you don't explicitly state what is the single most cause. So something, maybe you should say here, the single most enticing cause was abrasive British rule. That maybe you should say that. So that way it would be a little more clear as to what are you acknowledging as the single cause. Student number 10, the main causes of the revolution were the excessive taxes on the colonists without giving them a say in it. Okay. The Boston Massacre is what enticed the colonists to protest. Okay. The protests eventually evolved into the revolution that broke the colonists away from England. Okay. This is not needed in the thesis. That's already known. So the only thing here, I would give feedback with this first part. The main causes of the revolution were, the only thing you mentioned was excessive taxes. So you need many more causes here. That's just one cause, the excessive taxes. So you are not accounting for the other documents that were provided to you. You're only speaking to the taxation. And then here, when you're talking about the Boston Massacre, I would just add in a word of clarification, is what most enticed the colonists to protest. That would probably be a great descriptor, since the prompt asks you to determine the single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away. Well, you either need the word single, the single event that was most significant or had the largest impact, or something that the single event that most enticed the colonists. That needs to be in there, since that's what was asked. So here, feedback here, add more causes to what is enticing them to break away. It's not just excessive taxes. There are various other things, violence that erupted in the colonies, so many other things you could talk about. Student number 12, the causes of the American Revolution revolved around taxes and no representation in Parliament. All right, great. These are only 2 causes so far: taxes and representation in Parliament. Okay, so I guess if that's the only 2 things you want to talk about, that is fine. If those are the only 2 causes, I think you can roll with that. The only other thing you need is, what was the single cause? That is not stated in the thesis. That's a question that was asked but was not answered by student number 12. Student number 13 here, the underlying causes of the American Revolution were that there were issues concerning government among the colonies. Documents were created to promote equal rights for men and the branches of government, and political protests, which was why the colonists broke away. All right, this is actually fine. These are great categories. You have 3 categories here: issues concerning government, documents created to promote equal rights, political protests. Those are great categories. The only thing that's missing is what was the single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away. So you need another sentence here. You need one more sentence after that. Student number 14. Because the British Parliament thought it was necessary to impose taxes such as the Stamp Act and the Tea Act against the will of the Americans, the American Revolution sparked the beginning of American freedom and independence from Great Britain. Okay, so the way that you have categorized the causes of the revolution, so far you just talked about taxes. You do not give examples in the thesis statement. You don't need to give specific examples. You do that in the body paragraph. Keep it broad in the thesis. So imposing taxes, yes, that was a cause of the revolution. What were other causes? So you need to reevaluate the documents. A lot of the documents are not accounted for in this thesis. Then something else that's missing, and don't forget, just take this whole part out, such as the Stamp Act and the Tea Act. Or actually, this part needs to come out. So to impose taxes against the will of the Americans. Yeah, that's... And what's a little crazy here... Let me see. One of the things, and this is real obvious, but, oh, we already kind of talked about that. Okay, that's fine. We looked at your thesis from another angle. So, and don't forget here to add the single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away. You need to add that as well. You need to add that as well to your thesis. That's not evident. Alright, we need to hurry up. Oh, goodness. Alright, next, student number 16, the American Revolution was fueled by three main causes. Revolts that showed patriotic acts of independence, no taxation without representation. Okay, and declaration showed the world. Okay, excellent. This is a really good thesis statement. You just have one thing missing. The causes were articulated beautifully. That's fine. The only thing that's missing is what is the single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away. You need one more sentence here because that was asked in the prompt but was not answered. Government, economy, and violence were all major causes towards the American Revolutionary War. Okay, government. What kind of government? Government shows how reckless taxation by the British didn't help anybody. I'm not really sure what you're trying to say here. So if you are trying to hint that that maybe one of the causes of the war was an oppressive government, then maybe you should add some kind of descriptor or adjective. But just to say government was the cause of the revolution, well, you know, what about the government? And I just can't. I'm not sure what you're trying to say here. I just can't follow this. So maybe you're trying to talk about reckless taxation or oppressive taxation, but in the later future it gave hope to a new government. Economy, it shows that this is not reading well at all. I can't follow what you're saying. Economy, it shows how the British were ruining the colonist lifestyle. Maybe you should talk about depleting economy. You have to give a little more descriptives as to what are you critiquing about the economy. But just to say the economy for the sake of the economy, you're not conveying to your reader your point. And violence, it shows how... Okay, so yeah, go back and reword this. Not sure what's going on here, but the sentence does not read well. Also, you need some kind of you need a second sentence here to explicitly mention what was the single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away. You don't mention that. Number 19, colonists used various techniques to show their unsatisfaction through protesting, through representation, and the use of media. Newspapers, ads, through which colonies formed protests like the Boston Tea Party and a resolution of the state. Okay, so all of this is unnecessary. You don't need examples of newspapers, ads, and all that. So techniques to show their unsatisfaction, protesting, representation, and use of the media. Okay, those are all fine. So now you need another sentence as to what is the single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away. You don't talk about that. Number 20, the colonists strongly supporting independence from Great Britain due mainly to the small amount of freedom and rights. This, along with many other causes such as the Stamp Act, the Boston Tea Party, and the Boston Massacre, led to the Revolution. All right, so you are referencing specific events here, and in the thesis statement, you want to refrain from listing specific events. So reclassify these events. And so instead of saying the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre, maybe you could talk about colonial outbreaks to protest the British, because that would be an appropriate label for both the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre. In the Stamp Act, you just need to simply say taxes, because there were so many other taxes, not just the Stamp Act. So you don't want to isolate and narrow in and only talk about this one tax in your thesis. So also you need another sentence as far as which single cause most enticed the colonists to break away. Student number 21, many things in the colonies led to the Revolution, such as taxation, writs of assistance, and protests like the Boston Tea Party. Okay, so what was the single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away? That's not evident here in your thesis. And the only other pieces of feedback I have is that make sure you explain how each document supports the thesis when providing interpretive commentary. So student number 11, your interpretive commentary, and you see here on our sample sheet, the interpretive commentary gives an example. You go back to each document after the thesis is crafted. You go back to each document and you describe how does the document support the thesis, and which is your primary claim or argument. And so in your response, your interpretive commentary, document C shows a map, document D, colonists' reaction to the Stamp Act. All right, so that's not a statement of how it's proving your thesis. You are just writing down what you see, but you're not really explaining how it supports your thesis. And all of these students, more SFI is needed. You have to generate at least 5 pieces of SFI per document on the DBQ worksheet. Now, when you write the actual essay, you only need 15 pieces throughout the whole essay. But for the sake of the DBQ worksheet, you must generate at least 5 pieces per document. Look at the DBQ worksheet sample if you need an example or sort of how it works. But the whole point is just to get you brainstorming and to at least get you to think about what are the various different other historical events that you can link in or weave in when you're analyzing each document. All right, that's it.